Assalamualaikum and selamat sejahtera to Dr. Ismail. Today, me and my friends are going to present about the depositional structure and diagenesis in sedimentology and stratigraphy by Gary Nichols. These are the table of the content that we are going to present. First, post-depositional modification of sedimentary layers. Second, diagenetic process. Third, clastic diagenesis. Fourth, carbonate diagenesis. Fifth, post-depositional changes to evaporates. Sixth, diagenesis of volcaniclastic sediments. And lastly, the formation of coal, oil, and gas.
Sediment is generally deposited as layers that may contain features such as cross-bedding, wave ripples, or horizontal lamination formed during deposition, and these are referred to as primary sedimentary structures. The original layering and these sedimentary structures may be subject to modification by fluid movement and gravitational effects if the sediment remains soft. Disruption of the sedimentary layers may occur within minutes of deposition or may happen at any time up to the point when the material becomes solidified. Soft sediment deformation is the general term for changes to the fabric and layering of beds of recently deposited sediment. If the material remains soft, the initial layering and sedimentary formations may be altered by fluid movement and gravity influences. Soft sediment deformation takes a variety of forms at various scales and can occur in any sediment deposited subaqueously that retains some water after deposition, and they can be loosely grouped into structure due to sediment instabilities, liquefaction, fluidization, and loading, although these are not mutually exclusive categories. The deformation structures are mostly formed as a result of sediment instabilities caused by density contrast and by movement of pore fluids through the sediment. Liquefaction is a shorter-term process that happens when a mass of saturated sediment is affected by a shock, such as an earthquake, and becomes momentarily liquid, behaving like a viscous fluid. There is usually only very localized movement of sediment and fluid during liquefaction. Rapidly moving pore water causes fluidization of the sediment, which is carried upwards with the moving water. Finer sediment can be more easily carried upwards, so the process of electrification occurs as fine sand is carried by the fluid, leaving behind coarser and more cohesive material loading. Gravitational instabilities in sediment piles cause slumps and slump scars. When a pile of sediment is deposited on a slope, it is frequently unstable, even if the slope is only a few degrees. If the sediment body is subjected to a shock from an earthquake or the abrupt addition of extra sediment, failure and surfaces inside the sediment body may occur, resulting in material slumping. Slump beds are distorted into layers that often have a fold structure with the anticlined noses orientated downslope. When the slumping material is removed, the surface left behind is a slump scar, which is preserved when later sedimentation fills in the scar. Slump scars are recognized in the stratigraphic record as three-dimensional spoon-shaped surfaces ranging in size from a few meters to hundreds of meters across. They are most prevalent in delta sequences, but they can appear in any material deposited on a slope. There is a continuum of process and scale between slump scars and groove faults, which are surfaces within the sedimentary succession along which there is relative displacement. Groove faults are sedimentary structures, meaning that they arise during the deposition of a package of strata. They are most commonly found in delta front succession, where the deposition slope and the deep superposition of mount bar sands on top of delta front and per delta might result in gravitational instabilities within the succession. Failure occurs on weak horizons and propagates upward to form a spoon-shaped fault. Within the sedimentary succession, movement of the beds above the fold over the curve fault surface in the characteristic rotation of the beds. It can be distinguished from post-depositional faulting by the fact that a single fault affects only a portion of the succession, leaving overlying beds undisturbed. The layering within sediment can be disrupted during or under deposition by localized and small-scale liquefaction of the material. The structures range from slight cross strata over steepening to the formation of extremely bent and distorted layers known as convolute lamination and convolute bedding. These structures form when the sediment is either deposited on a slight slope or where there is a shear stress on the material due to flow or overlying fluid. The layered folds are typically asymmetric, with the nozzles of the anticline pointing downslope or in the direction of the flow. Convolute lamination is frequent in turbidites, where it may be seen in the laminated and cross-laminated regions of the beds. Sands deposited by avalanching down the lee slope of subaqueous dunes are loosely packed and saturated with water. They are easily liquefied and can be deformed by the shear stress caused by a strong current over a set of crossbeds. Shearing of the upper part of the crossbed creates a characteristic form called recumbent crossbedding or overturned cross stratification. Dewatering structures are soft sediment deformation structures created by fluidization processes that occur from the evacuation of pore water from a bed. These structures are concave interruption to the layering of sediments that range in size from a few millimeters to tens of centimeters. When a fracture occurs over an overpressured bed, the upward surge of pore fluids drives sediment into the crack. The sand may show some stratification parallel to the walls of the dike, but is generally structureless. There is a distinction to be made between clastic dikes, which are injected from below, and fissure fields, which are generated by passive infill from above of fissures and cracks in the underlying layers. Fissure fields form where fractures occur at the surface as a result of seismic activity or where the solution of they taper downwards can be filled with any size of class and can show multiple phases of opening filling where the earthquake related. The term Neptunian dike has been used in the past for this fissure field. Liquefied sediment brought to the surface in isolated parts emerges to form small sand volcanoes a few tens of centimeters to meters across. These eruptions of sand on the surface can be preserved only if low energy conditions prevent the sand being reworked by currents. Sand carried to the surface by clastic dikes can also spread out on the surface, typically in the form of an extruded sheet of sandy material. These sheets can be difficult to recognize if the connection with an underlying dike cannot be established. Intrusion upward movement of fluid. They are often picked out by fine clay laminae that are the cause of local barriers to fluid flow within the sediment. In plant view, this structure form polygonal shapes. Pillar structures, also known as filtration pipes, are vertical water escape conduits that can take the form of simple tubes or vertical sheets. Dish and pillar structures are frequently found together, but they can also form individually. The fluidization of a significant volume of sediment in the subsurface can result in sediment illustration and the production of vertical clastic dikes of centimeters across. These sheet-like vertical bodies are often made of fine sand and crosscut other forming sand seals, although they can also be difficult to distinguish. Lot casts form when higher density sand sinks into the underlying mud, forming downward-facing bulbous structures. The mud may alternatively be driven up into the overlaying sand bed, forming a flaming structure. These load cast elements are also known as ball and pillow constructions. They are common at the bottoms of sandy turbidite beds and other places where sand is dumped straight on wet muds. Next, the process of diaparism occurs when the instability caused by density variation between layers of unconsolidated silt result in large-scale material movement. This process can occur in a variety of rock and sediment types and geological environments, but it is most typically observed where the density contrast is high and low-density material is relatively mobile. The bulk density of a layer of rock or sediment is determined by two factors. First, the density of the materials, and the second, the proportion of the material that is occupied by pore spaces filled with gas or liquid. Salt diaparism and mud diaparism are two types of diaparism that are commonly seen in sedimentary succession, and they have two important implications for sedimentology and stratigraphy. First, diaparic structures can create local heights on the seafloor that can become the locus for carbonate development, and second, diaparism can create subsurface structure that can be hydrocarbon trapped. The mineral density of halite is 2.17 grams centimeter cube, which is significantly lower than most of sandstones and limestones, even if they are fairly porous. Halite is a solid, but like all geological materials, it will deform if subjected to a sufficient heat or pressure. The pressure required to allow halite to act plastically can be generated by a few hundred meters of overburden thickness, and due to its lower density, the halite mass will begin to rise up in locations where the overburden is thinner or weakened by faults. Salt tectonics occurs when the diaparic movement of salt deforms the overlaying strata. The impacts range from the formation of swells in the salt layer to the formation of dome-like entities that intrude into the overlaying layers, and the formation of locations where the salt mass breaks through the surface. Extruded salt may produce a mass of halite on the landscape in highly arid regions, similar to the particularly vicious volcanic flow. The second major type of diaparism happens when a layer or sediment has a high porosity and its density is lowered due to a high proportion of water mixed with the material. This is common in areas where muddy sediment is rapidly deposited. Water makes up around 75% of the bulk of mud that has recently been deposited on the seafloor. The water is eventually squeezed out as more sediment is deposited on top, but clay-rich deposits, while porous, have limited permeability because the plate-like clay minerals restrict fluid flow through the material. As a result, if there is insufficient time for the water to escape, it tends to become trapped within the muddy layers. This is especially frequent in deltas when fine-grained prodelta facies are overlain by delta front and delta top sands as the delta progrades. As a result, mud diaparism, also known as shale diaparism, is a prevalent feature of muddy deltaic succession.
Next, we'd like to go through the next subtopic, which is diagenetic process. Diagenesis refers to the physical and chemical changes that alter the characteristics of sediment. The condition for this process to occur, as shown in the diagram below, we can see that it occurs at relatively low temperatures, which is below 250 degrees Celsius and depth of up to about 5,000 meters. Generally, sediments are unconsolidated materials that are in the form of loose sand or gravel, soft mud, or accumulations of the body parts of dead organisms. So these sediments undergo lithification. Lithification is a process of changing this sediment to sedimentary rocks. It involves both chemical and physical changes that take place at any time after the initial deposition. So we will go through the burial diagenesis or compaction. Overburden pressure is the accumulation of sediments deposits being overlain by younger material and acts vertically on the body of sediment and increases as more sediment. Loose aggregates change the packaging of the particles. As shown in the diagram, the clouds move past each other into positions that take up less volume for the sediment body as a whole. The process of compaction increases the density of the sediment, and it occurs in all loose aggregates. And the pore water in the voids between the grains are then expelled throughout the process. Compaction has a little effect on horizontal layers of sediments except to reduce the thickness. Next is a differential compaction. It is a lateral change in the sediment type. For example, lime muds deposited around an isolated patch reef, sandbars surrounded by mud, and submarine channel cut into muds and filled with sands. A draping of finer sediments around the isolated body will occur under compaction. This effect is less marked in fluvials and succession. And why? It is because fine sediment on the floodplain dries out between flood events and loses most of its pore waters at that stage. Moving on, we have pressure solution or dissolution. As I've mentioned about the overburden pressures, when there is the presence of pore waters, diffusion takes place, moving the mineral away from the contact and reprecipitating it on free surfaces of the mineral grains. This process is called as pressure solution or pressure dissolution, where it results in grains becoming interlocked, providing a rigidity to the sediment. As shown in the picture is an example where pressure solution has occurred at the contact between two limestone pebbles. Lastly is the compaction effects. To determine the degree of compaction is to look at the nature of the grain contacts. As shown in the picture, there are four types of contacts that can be observed. Firstly is the point contacts that occurs under very little overburden pressure. Next is long contacts where there is reduction in porosity. Then we have concavo-convex contacts where one grain has dissolved at the point of the contact. Lastly is the citrate contact, which happens under very high overburden pressures. Now let's take a look at the chemical process of diagenesis, cementation. Most chemical changes occur in sediment that is buried and saturated with pore waters, and cements formed at this stage are called mesogenetic. Rarely cement formation occurs during uplift, known as telogenic cementation. Firstly, we'll take a look at dissolution. The process of grain dissolution is determined by the composition of the grain minerals and the chemistry of the pore waters. The presence of carbon dioxide in solution will increase the acidity of pore waters, and leaching of compounds from organic matter may also reduce the pH. Dissolution of a fossil after cementation may leave a mold of it, which may either remain as a void or may subsequently be filled by cement to create a cast of fossils. Next, the precipitation of cements. The process of cementation is the nucleation and growth of crystals within pore spaces and sediments. The most common minerals that can form cements are silica, usually as quartz but occasionally as chalcedony, carbonates, typically calcite, Aragonite, dolomite, and siderite cements are also known as clay minerals. The cements formed depends on the availability of different minerals in pore waters, the temperature, and the acidity of the pore waters. Growth of cement preferentially takes place on a grain of the same composition. Where the crystal in the cement grows on an existing grain, it creates an overgrowth with the grain, and the cement forms a continuous mineral crystal, and it is known as syntactial overgrowth. Cement growth tends to block up the gaps between the grain, reducing the permeability. Pore spaces can be completely filled by cement, resulting in a complete liquefaction of the sediment and a reduction of the porosity and permeability to zero. Moving on, we have recrystallization. The process of recrystallization is in the situ formation of new crystal structures while retaining the basic chemical composition. This process is common in carbonates of biogenic origin due to the mineral forms created by an organism such as aragonite or high magnesium calcite are not stable under diagenetic conditions, and they recrystallize to form grains of low magnesium calcite. Recrystallization may occur in many mollusks but does not occur diagenetic condition in groups such as crinoids, echinoids, and most brachiopods. Lastly is the replacement. The replacement of a grain by a different mineral occurs with grains of biogenic origin and also diarytyl mineral grains. For example, feldspars are diarytyl mineral grains, and to varying degrees all types of feldspar undergo breaking down diagenesis. The chemical reactions involve the formation of new clay minerals that may completely replace the volume of the original feldspar grain. Feldspar rich in calcium are the most susceptible to alteration and replacement by clay minerals, whereas sodium rich and particularly potassium rich feldspar are more resistant. Let's go to nodules and concretion. Most sedimentary deposits are heterogeneous, with variations in the concentration of different grain sizes and grain compositions occurring at all scales. These heterogeneities in the body mean that the processes that cause cementation are unevenly dispersed, and hence some parts become cemented more quickly than others. Where the distinction between well-indurated patches of sediment and the surrounding body of material is very marked, the cementation forms nodules and concretions. Irregular cemented patches are called as nodules, while more symmetrical, round, or discoid features are called concretions. They can be formed in any sediment that is porous and permeable. It is commonly seen in sandbeds, mud rock, limestone nucleated around a specific feature such as the body of a dead animal or plant debris. Next is a septarian concretion. It is the interiors of some carbonic concretion in mudstone display an array of cracks that are often filled with sparry calcite. It is believed to form during the early stages of burial of the sediment, and it results with shrinkage or related to excess pore fluid pressure in the concretion during compaction or both. Now we'll talk about the flints and other secondary sherds. Sherd can form directly from siliceous ooze deposited onto the seafloor. Sherd may also form in concretions or nodules as a result of the concentration of silica during diagenesis. The secondary sherds are diagenetically formed and are common in sedimentary rocks, especially limestones. The diagenetic origin to these sherds can be seen in replacement fabrics, where the structures of organisms that originally had carbonate had hard parts can be seen with the sherd nodules. Flint is a specific name given to nodules of sherd formed in the Cretaceous chalk. Finally, the color changes during diagenesis. Diagenetic color changes are obvious where the boundaries between the areas of different color are not related to primary bedding structures. In fine-grained sediments, reduction spots may form around particles of organic matter where the breakdown of the organic matter draws oxygen ions from the surrounding material and result in a localized reduction of oxides from a red or purple color to gray or green. Lees-Gangens bands are bands of colors formed by concentrations of iron oxides in irregular layers within a rock. Example is shown in the figure below. Other color changes may result from the formation of minerals such as zeolites, which are much paler than dark volcanic rocks within which they form.
Clastic diagenesis. The early stage of diagenesis in terrigenous clastic rock is mainly characterized by bural compaction as overburden pressure expels water from between grains and reduce the porosity. These are principally beaches where there is precipitation of calcite from seawater washing over the upper parts of a gravelly beach, the silcrate, pericrate formation in soils, the carbonate sedimentation forming hard crowns where there are very low rates of seafloor sedimentation and gypsum cementation in the coastal plains of arid coast. The calcite is an important sediment in many sandstone and conglomerate deposits in marine environments. The calcium carbonate commonly originates from aragonitic shelly material deposited along with the sand or gravel. Quartz cements in sandstones is the commonly occur as syntagel overgrowth. They form adjacent to pressure solution contacts by diffusion along grain boundaries or where there are waters rich in silica derived from dissolution of volcanic glass. Extremely fine quartz dust or skeletal material from sponges, diatoms, and radiolaria. The diagenesis and sandstone petrography. Diagenetic features can be difficult to be seen in hand specimen and investigation of the post-depositional features in a sedimentary rock normally requires examination of thin section. The first step is usually to distinguish between pore space, the areas between the grains, and voids metric, which is fine sediments, usually silt and clay, deposited with the grains and cement, which is made of minerals precipitated within the pore spaces. Once the thin section is cut, the porosity can then be identified as the areas of blue on the microscope slide. A metric composed of uh, detrital fine grains of clay and silt usually can be distinguished from a cement that is crystalline, except in case where the cement is form of clay minerals. Cement is form of clay minerals such as silica cement. Silica cement is quartz. Sandstone is usually seen as overgrowth of silica on the surface of some of the quartz grains. Next is the carbonate cements. The calcite cement is identified by the high relief compared with the grains and high birefringence color. Third is clay mineral cements. Using a petrographic microscope, clay mineral cements can be difficult to recognize, although sometimes can invent brown rims around grains may be interpreted as a clay cement layers. And lastly is the what we call that the compaction effects. Evidence for compaction of sediment during bural diagenesis can be recognized in thin section by the considering the spatial arrangement of the grains and the nature of the contacts between them. Next is clay mineral diagenesis. Mud deposits on the seafloor contains above 80% water by volume, so the first diagenetic process affecting muddy sediment is compaction and a considerable reduction in volume. During bural and increasing temperature, clay minerals undergo a range of changes in mineralogy that are determined by the original composition of the mineral and the the temperature reached during bural diagenesis. Halite is very common clay mineral, but it is uncommon as a weathering product from at the surface. Most halite minerals are formed diagenetically from other clay minerals such as smectite and uh, calliote at the temperature in excess of 708 degrees Celsius. Lastly is diagenesis of organic matter in marine muds. Shallow marine environment are regions of high biogenetic productivity, and the mud's deposit on the seafloor of the shelf is rich in remains of organisms. The diagenesis of this organic material takes place in a series of depth-definite zones. Organic material at the surface is subject to bacterial oxidation, a process that dominates the upper few centimeters of the sediment, where it is oxygenated by diffusion and bioturbation. Below the surface layer, sulfate reduction takes place down to about 10 meters. The carbonic materials such as calcite and siderite are precipitated in this zone, which extend down about 1000 meters. At deeper levels, any remaining organism matter is broken down inorganically. That's all from me. Thank you.
Okay, next we move to the carbonate diagenesis. Cement and carbonate rocks are mainly made up of calcium carbonate derived from the host sediment. Litification of aggregates of carbonate material can occur as eugenetic cementation contemporaneously with deposition in any settings, where there is either a lot of seawater being circulated through the sediment or where sedimentation rates are low. If sedimentation rates are low in warm tropical shallow marine environments, seawater is frequently saturated with calcium carbonate and cementation can occur on the seafloor, forming a hard ground or firm ground. Cementation can be localized and linked to microbial activity within the sediment, such as burrows. Colder seawater is less saturated with calcium carbonate, allowing carbonate material to dissolve. Calcite cementation occur in non-marine environment in both the vadose zone above the water table and the phreatic zone below the water table. The precipitation of calcite to form this cement in the vadose environment such as cave and streams is caused by water degassing, which is the resulting deposits of stalactites and stalagmites in cave. Stalactites and bedding planes are example of compaction effect in limestone. Under the pressure of a few hundred meters of overburden, calcite undergoes pressure dissolution, forming dissolution surface within the rocks known as stalactites. Stalactites are highly irregular solution surface that are picked out by concentration of clay, iron oxide, or other insoluble rock component on a small scale in millimeters to centimeters. They usually form horizontally as a result of overburden pressure, but they can also form as a result of tectonic pressure at high angles to the bedding. Horizontal pressure of solution surface within a limestone succession create apparent bedding surface that may be very sharply defined by the high concentration of clay along the surface, but do not always represent a break in sedimentation. This diagenetic bedding may be more sharply defined in outcrop than true bedding surface representing primary changes and break in deposition. Pressure solution can remove large amount of calcium carbonate and concentrate the clay component of an impure muddy limestone, resulting in nodules of limestone in a wavy bedded mudstone. Next is dolomitization. Dolomite is a calcium magnesium carbonate mineral found in carbonate sedimentary rocks of all ages. When the mineral accounts for more than 75% of the rocks, it is referred as a dolostone. The mineral is uncommon in modern depositional environments. However, it is known to occur in small quantities in arid coastal settings, where its formation may be related to microbial activity. However, this modern example do not explain the thick succession of dolostone known from the stratigraphic record, and most dolomite is thought to form diagenetically a process known as dolomitization. Dolomitization appears to be aided by higher temperature and either increase or decrease salinities in comparison to seawater. The dolomitization is a reversal of the process that caused dolomitization in association occur from gypsum when gypsum beds dissolve, enriching groundwater with calcium sulfate. Sulfate-rich water passing through dolostone cause dolomite to be replaced by calcite. The mid-sink zone model for dolomitization proposed to the dolomitization occurs when freshwater which is undersaturated with respect to calcite but oversaturated with respect to dolomite mixed with marine water. Then we have diagenesis and carbonate petrography. Most carbonate sediments liquefy during diagenesis and can be easily cut to make thin section. However, injection of the blue resin into the pore space is commonly performed to make any void within the rock visible. Neomorphism carbonate mud is the primary component of carbonate mudstone and wackerstone, and it can also be found as a matrix in peckstone, grainstone, and boundstones. Because individual grains are clay size, they cannot be seen with a petrographic microscope. Carbonate mud frequently undergoes neomorphism, which is replacement by recrystallization to form microcrystalline spherical The crystalline formed under the microscope. Although it may be difficult to resolve individual crystal, the microsphere appeared as a mass of fine crystalline material showing different biofragrance colors under crosspolar. The biofragrance color of carbonate are high order pink and green, which may appear to merge into a pale brown if the individual crystals are very small or the magnification is low. The cementation of carbonate sediment to form limestone may involve several stages of cement formation. The position of the sediment relative to the groundwater level determines the form of eugenetic cement. The formation of a thin fringe of calcite or aragonite growing perpendicular to the grain boundary or into the pore space is the first stage of the phreatic zone, where all those pore space are filled with water. These crystals form a thin layer of approximately equal thickness over the grain. The sediment is in the weathered zone above the water level in the intertidal and supratidal zone and is only periodically saturated with water. Cement form only where grains are close together within water held together by surface tension to form a meniscus. The calcium carbonate used in this very cement may be derived from the dissolution of aragonite from shelly material or from pressure solution at grain contacts and along stylolite. The majority of dolomite found in the sedimentary rocks is diagenetic in nature, occurring as a replacement for calcite. Despite the fact that the optical properties of calcite and dolomite are very similar, dolomite is commonly found as distinct, small rhomb-shaped crystal that replace the original calcite fabric. Extensive dolomitization may occur, obliterate the primary fabric of the limestone, resulting in a rock that appear as a mass of rhombic crystal in thin section. Calcite transformation into dolomite result in a decrease in mineral volume and as a result an increase in porosity. Move to evaporate depositional changes. Evaporate mineral may be dissolved out of subsurface beds or replaced by less soluble minerals such as calcite and silica. Dissolution by pore water passing through the beds creates vaults and caverns that collapse under the weight of the overburden, resulting in the formation of a dissolution breccia. Breccia formed in this manner are composed of angular strata bedded with or immediately overlying the evaporate, with no evidence of class transport. Voids between the class may be filled with cement. Initial gypsum burial and heating result in dehydration and replacement by anhydrite. If anhydrite beds are unlit to a hydrous near surface environment, they may changes to gypsum. The substitution of calcite and silica for halite, gypsum, and anhydrite can occur at any stage of diagenesis. The original cubic crystal form of halite can be preserved as a pseudomorph, a fine-grained sedimental cast. Pseudomorph of selenite, a type of gypsum, can also occur. Anhydrite can be replaced with microcrystalline or chalcedonic quartz.
In diagenesis of volcanic lastic sediments, all the crystal, lithics, and vitreous particulate materials in volcanic lastic deposits are susceptible to diagenetic alteration. Volcanic glass changes form in the absence of any other medium because it is metastable and revitrified. Changes form from glass to mineral form to form very fine crystalline minerals. Tungstines are kaolinite-rich mud rocks formed from volcanic. Bentonites are composed mainly of smectite clays that are alteration products of basaltic rock. Formation of coal, oil, and gas is a branch of geology that study of fossil fuels that formed by the genetic processes that alter material from organism remains. In coal-forming environments, mayas are waterlogged areas of deep accumulation of incompletely decomposed organic material. A wet environment is required to form a maya and therefore a peat, so environment of belt formation tends to be concentrated in the water climatic belts around the equator and in temperate higher latitudes. Mayas can be divided into two types. First one, ombotrophic mayas or bogs, areas where most of the input water is from rainfall. The other one is eutrophic mayas or swamp, places where there is a true flow of groundwater. In addition, there is also eutrophic mayas that have an input of classic sediment, and these are referred to marshes or salt marshes if the water input is saline. Bogs tend to have little classic input, so the peat and hence coal is almost pure plant material. Swamp environments can be more extensive, but the true flowing water may bring in clay, silt, and sand particles that make the coal impure. Also, if the water is saline, it will contain sulfates, and this leads to the formation of sulfides in the coal and give the deposit of high sulfur content, which is not desirable because it results in sulfur dioxide emission when the coal is burned. The ash and sulfur content are two factors that are considered when assessing the coal grade. The lower they are, the higher the grade. Coals that originate as peat deposits are known as humic coal and can be origins of natural gas. Sapropellic coals are deposits of aquatic algae that accumulate in the bottoms of lakes, and they can be source rocks for oil. The first stage of peat formation is the aerobic biochemical breakdown of plant tissue at the surface. This initially formed peat is used as fuel in places but has low calorific value. The calorific value increases as the peat is buried under hundreds of meters of other sediments and subjected to an increase in temperature and pressure. Temperature is more important as it increases with depth, the geothermal gradient. The peat goes through a series of changes. The coal rank is described as differences in the degree to which the original peat has been coalified. Transitional between peat and true coal is lignite, or called brown coal. Going through the series, low rank coal is referred to subbituminous coal, middle rank is bituminous, and the highest rank coal are anthracite. Naturally occurring oil and gas are principally made up of hydrocarbons. The hydrocarbon compounds originate from organic matter that has accumulated within sedimentary rocks and are transformed into petroleum by the process of hydrocarbon maturation that occur in a series of stages dependent on temperature and time. The first stage is Diagenesis, biochemical degradation of proteins and carbohydrates in organic matter. It eliminates oxygen from corrosion. It occurs at temperature of up to 40 degrees Celsius and at depth just over 1000 meters. Three types of corrosion are: type 1 is derived from planktonic algae and amorphous organic material. It is the most important in generating oil. Type 1 consists of mixed marine and continental organic materials such as algae, spores, and cuticles, which forms gas and waxy oils. Type 3 originates from terrestrial woody matter and is a source of gas only. At burial depth from 1000 to 4000 meters and at temperature between 40 degrees to 150 degrees Celsius, catalgenesis occurs, or also known as oil window, further transform the corrosion. At high temperature and burial depth, only methane is produced from all corrosion types, a stage known as metagenesis. Formation of oil, which is made up of relatively long-chain hydrocarbons that are liquid at surface temperature from sedimentary organic matter, requires a part of set of conditions. First, the organic matter must include the remains of planktonic algae that will form carb-1 corrosion. This material normally accumulates in anaerobic condition in anoxic marine environment and in lakes. Second, the organic material must be buried in order that catalgenesis can generate liquid hydrocarbons within the correct temperature window. The third factor is time, because the corrosion source rock has to lie within the oil window for millions of years to generate significant quantities of petroleum. Oil and gas become trapped in the subsurface where there is a barrier formed by impermeable rocks known as cap rocks. The hydrocarbon will go around the cap rock barrier unless there is a hydrocarbon trap that prevents further upward migration. Structural traps are formed by faults such as anticlines, especially dome shaped in 3 dimensions, and by faults that seal a porous reservoir rocks again an impermeable unit. Other traps are stratigraphic traps formed beneath unconformities and in places where the reservoir rocks pinches out laterally. In the absence of traps and caps, the hydrocarbon reaches the surface and leaks to the atmosphere. Partial release of hydrocarbons from the subsurface as oil seeps and gas seeps can be important signs of the presence of hydrocarbons. On the other hand, for a sedimentary rock to be a suitable reservoir unit, it must be porous and permeable. Porosity is presented as percentage of the rock volume. Permeability is expressed in Darcy units with a value of 1 Darcy representing a very good permeability for a hydrocarbon reservoir. The reservoir quality of a rock is reduced by 2 main factors. First is the presence of mud because clay minerals fill the spaces between grains. Second, sedimentation because it crystallizes minerals in the pore spaces. Last but not least, knowledge of the depositional history of an area is required for hydrocarbons exploration to determine whether suitable source rock have been formed and there are reservoir and cap literacies in the overlying subsection. Knowledge of post-depositional event is also important to provide an assessment of the thermal and burial history.